this share for the refuah of Leah Masha Batsara, and we hope Rebbetzin Lied Cohen makes a full recovery. Kevin's going to start by teaching us an idea or two. Before we
And also, can we include another refuah?
Absolutely.
For the Jewish people who are recovering in Turkey from the earthquake. There have been some were trapped and some have been rescued. And hopefully they're all going to be rescued.
Absolutely, every single Yid, 100%.
Yeah. Okay, so continue the theme of davening. So in davening by oneself, it says where to daven. I found this from an authentic website. It says you shouldn't daven in front of mirrors because the distraction, your kavanah will be affected because it looks like you're davening to oneself. It says that actually in the Mishnah Berurah. And so obviously in a shul, one should try daven in the same place. And I think probably at home as well. It doesn't say so here. A certain place like in a dining room or where it's there are not too many things that are going to distract you. Then it says, let me just go to something that's much more interesting. So Damon, just stop me when you need to, eh?
Sure.
So parts that we don't say when we daven alone. We obviously don't say, you can't say Kaddish, you can't say Kedusha, because that requires a minyan, and also Baruch Hu. And then it says here, what about Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh? That is that's also at the end of the Ashrei of Al-Tzion. So I think that you do say that because that's part of it. It's not connected to Kedusha. It's part of the last Ashrei. Just trying to see what it says here. As far as I know, you do say that because that's part of it. Let's just see 1 second. So I just got this a couple of minutes ago. I'm just trying to see here. Okay, and when you do, it doesn't say anything against. It doesn't say that you can't do it. Then that when you do tachanun, you don't put your head on your arm, on your forearm, on the outside of your forearm. You don't do that because you only do it when there's a Sefer Torah in close proximity, like in a shul, or if someone has a private minyan. Okay, let's just see. That's it. Okay, yeah. Okay, and obviously you can't read from a Torah scroll if you by yourself. As far as I know, not that most people have a Torah scroll. Okay, and yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. All right.
You can read the Torah in a chumash. You can use a chumash, not the actual scroll. You should always use a chumash.
Yeah, exactly.
That's which most of us have anyway. So.
All right. So I'll tell you where we ended yesterday. We were discussing this concept of Rav Papa compared to Rav Zaved, because Rav Zaved said, Rabbi Yehuda said, the stolen animal is returned as it is. And Rabbi Shimon said, we view it as if it was an article appraised and placed with him according to its cash value at the time of the robbery. So what's the difference between them? Because after all, both agree that the robber returns the cow ewe plus the value of the unborn calf or wool, shearings, etc. And the robber keeps the appreciation of what was affected through the birth of the shearing because it physically changed. But if you study the price itself, we said that although there's no difference between them, when the byproduct is detached, and that physically changes. When the byproduct is part of the animal itself, it's at that version that they disagree. Why? Well, firstly, let's see what one has to say. Rav says Rav Yehuda holds that they belong to the one that was robbed, meaning the victim. Because what he's saying is that even if an animal becomes pregnant or grows a bit of hair, it hasn't intrinsically changed to such a physical degree that it now is acquired by the robber. The robber makes the cash equivalent. It's returned to the original victim. Rabbi Shimon holds that if the animal is himself changed, that, in other words, the byproducts are still part of the animal, then in fact that is a physical change, and that it is significant, like a different trimester of pregnancy in an animal perhaps, or alternatively, you might have a case where the hair growth of wool has physically changed the animal, because you say, well, if the animal hasn't changed, how do we determine that it's changed? Well, one of the things that I suppose we could say is that the value's changed of the animal, and that creates a significant enough physical change where we assess the animal differently, just a point of view. And Rav Papa doesn't agree at all. He said that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon say that when the improvements are still attached to the stolen article, they still belong to the robber. But the only difference is that as far as Rav Yehuda is concerned, according to Rav Papa, that all the improvements that are still attached to the stolen article belong entirely to the robber. So in other words, according to Rav Papa, he doesn't hold that Rav Yehuda holds a difference of whether there's detachment from the animal, the byproduct, or the improvements are still growing on the animal. It's a physical enough change to render the article belonging to the robber, and therefore the cash equivalent has to be paid to the victim. But Rabbi Shimon holds that if there's detachment, then in that particular case, the physical enough change from a fetus to a calf is significant, and change from hardly any hair of wool to a substantial takeaway of wool is a physical change in the property of the wool, not in the animal. And therefore, if it's detached, it belongs entirely to the robber. But if it's still attached, then it's seen more of a case of almost a custodian, a shomer, at which case Rabbi Shimon says that the improvements that are still attached to the stolen article belong to the robber only in as much as he needs to be paid for those improvements. So in other words, at the court date later, they found out that the animal had improved in value from the time of the robbery to the time of the trial. And it's on those improvements where the victim has to compensate the robber somewhat, because the restitution is actually for the time period of the robbery. Does that make sense? So Gavin touched on this, so you're saying, well, why would you want to reward the robber? Which is Rabbi Meir's opinion. There's no byproduct improvement, not even a share that the robber gets to keep. And that would completely disagree with Rav Papa's view of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon is saying that we agree it's not a lot, but it certainly could have left the animal in a malnourished and neglected state. So there's some sort of custodianship, etc., because the animal did improve, and probably that took money to feed. So this custodianship is different to a case of adding more food than necessary, because remember, we discussed a case that there's a difference between keeping the animal alive and it growing naturally in terms of the stage of development, like from a fetus to calf, paired with somebody that's getting proper nutritionist and a vet and trying to fatten this animal up and going above and beyond the call of duty. I hate cell phones. I hate them. As far as that's concerned, it's good. Rabbi Shimon holds that the improvement is not. You don't have to recompensate the robber for the improvement if it's within the normal feeding process, because the robber didn't do you any favors. Why? The robber wasn't intending to be a shomer and return it to the victim. The court made him return it to the victim, but it's some way that the thought that was put forward that it could not have been necessarily because it was a prevailing custom, that compensatory rate is almost like a form of teshuva, where at least the robber doesn't feel resentful for having looked after the animal well. And he's being compensated in some manner as if he's a shomer. because otherwise that won't aid his teshuva. He'll feel like he lost out. The fact that he's a pathological individual and didn't realize that he never looked after it because of some altruistic method of helping the victim, well, that's a cognitive dissonance issue. So what we are saying is, why is it a half, a third, or a quarter? Because there's different customs in different towns about how much commission the custodian gets. So we're saying, okay, so we went backwards and forwards and said, all right, well, we were seeming to struggle with it a little bit, and then there was an explanation given where we accepted Rav Papa's explanation a bit easier, because Rav Zavid seems to hold more according to our Mishnah. So we struggled a bit with the Rav Papa issue. Now, I'm not doing a repeat of yesterday or the day before, so I'm not going through that whole discussion. What we discussed yesterday, which is a different issue, is, well, if you are paying, if you look at this question with Rav Ashi, who studied in the Academy of Rav Kahana, according to Rav Shimon, he says that you can remove the robber from his obligation by giving him a half, a third, or a quarter. Do you actually have to give him the animal itself? Meaning, do you have to give him the part of the fetus if it's still attached to the cow once it gives birth, or it's pulled out prematurely? Or do you give him the cash equivalent of his share? It's the same with the wool. Do you give him the wool, or do you give him the cash equivalent share? The example we've used yesterday is that, well, we want to know why you can give the cash equivalent, and the two examples that I thought of just off the bat yesterday was, number one, Kevin might want a jersey for winter. It's only selling the wool, and he has to give the robber that in terms of commission, and he's got a pretty useless byproduct because there's not enough of it to go around for him to make a jersey. So it might be more prudent for him to actually give the cash equivalent to the robber so that he can wear something substantially warmer. Now, the same thing comes where you've got a Haredi family that got 7 kids. And we said yesterday, well, you don't want one of the kids to go starving and go to therapy that he was neglected by his families while the others ate a Shabbos dinner. So what you would want to do then is give the robber his share of the fetus. Otherwise, you've got one kid short of food. So that's why cash equivalent would make sense. So we are saying, well, where do we learn this sort of issue from? So we learned this from an inquiry which Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel, and it said, for 3 people we assess the improvement that they made to the land, and we remove them from the land through paying them the amount of that assessment in cash. These are the 3 examples. The firstborn pays cash to the ordinary son for his share of the improvements in his land. And a creditor pays cash to the buyer of the debtor's property for improvements that the buyer made to that property. And the third example is an accreditor pays cash to the orphans of his debtor for improvements that they made to their inherited property. On the basis of this teaching of Shmuel, the inquiry raised by Rav Ashi was resolved. Now, that first case we said yesterday of Arthur came with some complicated maths, and by the way, his mathematics was 100% correct. But why we chose a simple example is I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, and I thought if you keep the principle in your mind without getting distracted by a myriad of fractions in mathematics, it's going to be a lot easier to contain. So it's not that the firstborn gets 2/3 or gets half or gets like that. That's the wrong equation. Let me tell you how you could come to that erroneous conclusion. Very simply, you've got 3 brothers, right? Now, the Torah actually says in Devarim in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17, that the oldest brother gets double. But if you came off the wrong end of the sticker, you don't know the source, and you're observing it as an alien within a context of anthropology, what you see is something that looks a little bit different. What do we mean? Is that you see that the 2 brothers get 25%, and the oldest brother gets 50%. So you think, when you're looking at that field as an alien, looking at anthropology and studying different cultures, that the oldest brother gets basically half the land, right, compared to the other brothers. That's what the mathematics would seem. If you have a case where the older brother and you just have another brother, then what happens is the older brother keeps 2/3 and the younger brother keeps 1/3. So now you're thinking that the older brother gets 2/3 of the property, and your equation has gone from keeping the older brother keeping half to keeping 2/3. So if you look it up like that, it's going to mess you up. So forget about the mathematics. Your core principle is the opposite. Is you're saying the oldest brother gets double. When you do that, you work out all the number of brothers that come from that vantage point, and then you divide the land up appropriately, because that principle will be consistent. But if you look at the outcome, you're going to divide it in terms of either percentages of half or 2/3, and you're going to come to an erroneous conclusion. So the only thing you've got to bear in mind is the oldest brother keeps double. There's an interesting reason for it, by the way, in one of the sources. As they said, the parents generally mess up the oldest kid. Why? Is because they have no history of how to be a parent. So what happens is if you have 6 or 7 kids, the last kid you already know what to do. The first kid you kind of a trial and error in terms of how you raise them. So in compensation for the way you could have killed them or messed them up psychologically, they get a double share. It's only according to one opinion, by the way, as to the reason. The reason is that it says in the Chumash, but that was what you call one of the explanations that came forward, which was quite interesting. Now, what we are saying is that since the older brother gets double, he only gets double of the actual land inherited by the father. So if the land was worth 100 zuz, okay, then what happens is that the older brother gets a double portion of the younger portion. So what happens in that particular case is we say, okay, it's pretty straightforward, but the property is worth now, after the brother worked on it, the brothers together worked on it after the father's death, it's worth 150 zuz now because there's improvements, there's agricultural improvements. So you would say, okay, so it's pretty fair. Give the older brother 100 zuz worth of the field and the improvements, and give the younger brother 50 zuz. And the Torah says that's not what we do, because nowhere in the pasuk does it say that the oldest brother gets double the portion of the improvements, only of the base land itself. So what we see is, what is the land valued in terms of inheritance? 100 zuz. Okay? Now, what then is the value of the improvement? It would be that they get the 25 zuz each of that, and the older brother gets 2/3 of the 100. So instead of using that sort of example where the mathematics is a little bit difficult to work out, let's use a reference of easier mathematics. By the way, one of the sources you can see about it explaining in Deuteronomy that improvements are shared amongst the brothers, and only the older brother gets the double portion of the actual land, is in Bava Basra 124a. So let's use...
Damon, can I interrupt? Sorry, I apologize. If the father makes the improvements and not the children, then the brother will still get a double portion with the improvements, correct or not?
Absolutely. So I think that's a brilliant question. It was worth the interruption. So Gavin is saying, but there's improvements. So the improvements are only judged from the timeline of inheritance after they've inherited the property until the period of time of the harvest or the next harvest, etc. So whatever it's worth, etc., would be for the actual land. So how would it work out? Because the father doesn't always choose his timing to die once the field has been harvested, where it's a complete fallow land, because in that case there might be improvements. So what would happen then would be, for example, I actually don't know exactly what would happen then and how it would be calculated, but I'm assuming it would be the same principle, that the improvements would be harvested at that point, whether the brothers worked together or not, and the father initially did the improvements, and the revenue from those improvements would be shared amongst the brothers. Okay, the revenue of those improvements for sure. But the base land, once harvested, the older brother gets a double portion. That's how it would be. Okay. So, what we're saying is here, let's work out simple maths. You got two brothers. They inherit a field worth 60 zuz. Right? So there, in a very simple case, we've got a case where the oldest brother would get a double portion compared to the youngest. So his part of the land would be worth 40 zuz, and the younger brother would get 20 zuz. So in principle, the older brother has 2/3 of the land and the younger brother has a third. But it's not because it's divided in categories of thirds or halves, because if there are three brothers, the older brother would get half the land compared to the other two brothers, because they're each getting 25%, 25%, and the older brother gets double, which is 50. So in 100 zuz, he would get 50 zuz and the other brothers, and it would look like he's earning 50%, but it's not. You just know that the older brother earns double. So you can't work it out in a percentile. You've got to work it base point. That's all I'm saying. So say you got an older brother and another brother, and the land is worth 60 zuz. The older brother gets 40 zuz, the younger brother gets 20. So the older brother gets 2/3 or a double portion from the other brother. Now the improvements have to be split evenly. So we would have thought that the older brother gets 2/3 of that, and it's not true. So then what would happen is each brother would get, principally, if the improvements were worth 12 zuz, each brother would get 6 zuz each. But it doesn't work like that always when you're harvesting the field, because it's very difficult to start to use measuring tapes and everything else. So you work out a very, very simple calculation, is that if you divide 12 zuz, and the older brother gets a double portion, he's actually getting 8 zuz to the younger brother's 4. So all that would happen to even it out is the older brother would then compensate the younger brother with 2 zuz of cash to make the improvements evenly split, but he still gets a double portion in the land. You get what I'm saying? That's all it's saying. So what's the lesson from this? This lesson is that the restitution can be made in cash. Because that's the question in the Gemara. Can you compensate a robber in a cash equivalent, or do you have to share the byproduct with him of the wool or the fetus? And we say, no, you can redeem it for cash as long as he gets his share. So this is one of the evidences for it in Bava Basra 124a, that the older brother can give his brother the extra 2 zuz in cash that he owes him to redeem it, where the improvements are even. Let's look at a second case, is that a creditor pays cash to the buyer of the debtor's property for improvements that the buyer made to that property. I'll repeat it again. And a creditor pays cash to the buyer of the debtor's property for improvements that the buyer made to that property. So what do we mean here? We mean basically, guys, when a debtor sells land on which his creditor has a lien, okay? And the buyer subsequently improves the land. The creditor's lien is only limited to the original land and does not extend to the improvements. Okay, so let's take an example. If the land was originally worth 100 zuz and the buyer improved it so now it's worth 150 zuz, the creditor can collect no more than 100 zuz from the land. Now, guys, you might have thought that the creditor is entitled to only 2/3 of the improved land, while the buyer keeps the other third. So you might have said, okay, he's entitled to 2/3. Why? He's only owed 100 zuz. Give him 2/3 of the field and let the buyer keep a third. Okay? Because it still works out financially like that, Kevin. You get it? So he's saying you can't do that. What you've got to do, because it could have been thought that the creditor is entitled to 2/3 of the improved land, and the buyer can keep the other third, right? So Shmuel teaches that that's not so. So that the creditor has to take the entire field, because that was actually mortgaged to his debt. And he pays the buyer 50 zuz in cash for his improvements, which means this is proving again that you can pay the robber cash for the improvements. It's saying you can redeem it with cash. These are cases where the redemption basis is done in cash and not in improvements. So there's not in these cases in the Gemara, there's not a choice. You have to make a cash restitution because of the way the pasuk. You can't get the redemptive improvements. This is a fact. So we extend this to a robber at which it's an option. You can also share the fetus in the war, but these two cases, you can't. You can't have the brothers work it in a way where it's unfair. You can't work it in a case where basically that the buyer turns around to the creditor and says, oh, take 2/3 of the land. I want to keep a third portion. No. Why? Because who came first, the creditor or the buyer? The debtor wasn't even meant to sell the property to the buyer. And the buyer should have done his due diligence. He's lucky he's getting the cash and the improvements at all. The creditor can't be chased from his land. That's not fair. Who came first? The creditor, not the buyer. Do you get what I'm saying? Who came first? The older brother or the younger brother? The younger brother. But yes, but then the older brother, the younger brother can't basically take that valued in terms of improved lands from the older brother. They must share the improvement value and be compensated. Now, there's a last case, and that is an accreditor pays cash to the orphans of his debtor for improvements that they made to the inherited property. So what do we mean? So, guys, it's similar to the preceding case. When orphans inherit and then improve the land that was mortgaged to their father's creditor, the creditor's lien does not extend to the improvements. So, for example, again, we're going to say, if the land was originally worth 100 zuz, and the orphans improved it, so it's now worth 150 zuz, the creditor can collect no more than 100 zuz from that land. So what does that teach us? Well, Shmuel teaches us exactly the same in that case as well, that the orphans cannot give the creditor only 2/3 of the improved land and keep the other third for themselves. Because again, their father landed up being financially saved by the creditor, so now they can't cut him out the picture. So the creditor is entitled to take the entire field, which was mortgaged to his debt, and he's entitled to not leave the orphans bereft, and he has to give that 50 zuz in cash for the improvements. So that's Rashi's explanation of Shmuel. Does that make sense? It's pretty clear.
Yep.
Okay. Is this someone?
No. Good question. When you say improvement, you mean the products that they bed that year, or actually the physical fencing and all that stuff made it look beautiful? I don't understand what.
Okay, I think Arthur's asking a brilliant question, because Arthur's saying, listen, improvements can fall into two categories. It's a brilliant question. Are we talking about agricultural development of produce, or are we talking about improvements to the actual land like equipment and fencing, etc.? And the Gemara is going to deal with it in ensuing dafs. And in fact, it's going to be touched upon now. It's going to say in a half a daf's time, well, what do you consider an improvement? Is it when it still needs the land, the produce, or when it's independent of the land, or what stage of development of improvement? So I think Arthur's touched on a great point. Well, don't be vague about the word improvement. What do you mean? Are you talking about the actual equipment? Are you talking about the fencing and security? Are you talking about agricultural produce? What are you talking about? Well done, mate. That's a superb question. Superb. Okay. See, Arthur's like a crocodile. He doesn't look sometimes like he's awake and he can move fast. But boy, if there's a deer near the water, it's dead. Don't be fooled. Oaks alert. Okay. So the Gemara is going to digress, and then it deals with the difficulty of a ruling that Shmuel just cited. Ravina said to Ravashi, said, but did Shmuel indeed say that a creditor gives the buyer compensation for his improvements? Because they have a case, he said, where Shmuel said a creditor collects the improvements that the buyer made to the land without compensating the buyer for them. So what it's saying is here is, look, we're learning in our particular Gemara that Shmuel says that a creditor must give the buyer compensation for the improvements. But Ravina said to Rav Ashi, we've got other cases in the Gemara where a creditor collects the improvements that buyers made and they don't have to compensate the buyer. So how do you reconcile those two contradicting statements? And the Gemara answers, Rav Ashi said to him, it's not difficult. Here in the ruling cited by Rav Nachman, this is the daf we're dealing with now, because it says Rav Nachman quoted Shmuel. So in this case of Rav Nachman, where the creditor must compensate the buyer for improvements, Shmuel is dealing with improvement that reaches the shoulders. In other words, what do we mean reaches the shoulders? Exactly in answer to Arthur's question. And if you look, it's in Bava Kamma 15b. It talks about if an improvement's to the shoulders, it's saying that grain is fully grown. That's what it says, reaching the shoulders. Now, there's different types of reaching the shoulders. Kevin is tall, so that's when it's fully grown. I'm the height of a hobbit, so in my case, I would
substantial improvements.
No. We're not talking.
You say substantial,
noticeable. We're saying, listen, there's different levels of a field in terms of improvements of agriculture. When grain is fully grown, it no longer needs the land. Okay, so it's about to be harvested. So then, in that particular case, there's no compensation to the buyer, because the buyer gets to keep that grain. It doesn't belong as the creditor's lien. It doesn't need the property anymore. It belongs to the buyer. It's not sucking the land of nutrition. Then you get a sort of produce which is still not fully grown, that's still partially dependent upon the land for growth, and therefore that's a case where there can be dependency on the land, at which case we're going to say that the buyer must be compensated by the creditor. In a case where there's nothing grown from that point, at that particular point of development, after the seeds were just sown in its initial growth, that it's totally dependent on the land and nothing is shown, and therefore in that case the creditor who has that land doesn't have to compensate the buyer for anything because nothing's grown. So those are your three stages of development, Kevin. Excellent question, excellent. So all I'm saying is Rav Ashi says that in this ruling with Rav Nachman, when the creditor must compensate the buyer for the improvements, Shmuel is dealing with agriculture that reaches the shoulders, meaning it's ready to be harvested and carried onto the shoulders. Okay, I thought it had to be the height of the shoulders, and my question was, Kevin's taller than me. I'm the height of a hobbit. It's not going to do full growth if it hits my shoulders. It's still got months left of the land. So now we've answered the question of my stupidity and confirmed it. So what we are talking about there is a case of, it's talking about reaching the shoulders, not in terms of height, but reaching the shoulders means it's that time to cut it and carry it on your shoulders, meaning that that produce is fully developed and no longer leads the land. So here in the ruling you, Ravina, has just cited, where the creditor can collect the improvements without compensating the buyer, Shmuel is dealing with improvements that do not reach the shoulder. So what it's saying is that produce that is not ready for harvest at all, okay, is considered part of the land, and Shmuel allows the creditor to collect it without compensating the buyer for the value. But if it's fully grown, you've got a different issue, because Ravina rejects the answer. Because Ravina says to him, look, there were instances daily when creditors would approach Shmuel, and Shmuel would allow them to collect from purchases of the debtor's land, even from improvements that reached the shoulders, without compensating the purchaser for the improvement. Okay? So they're saying basically it's not difficult. The ruling that the creditor collects the buyer's improvements without compensating him refers to where the creditor has a claim on him. Look, we're not going to talk about full claims now. I think we've got 2 minutes left. What we are saying is that there are basically 3 stages. Okay, 3 different categories. The first one is produce that's completely ripened. The creditor can't collect that at all. It's got nothing to do with the land. It's no longer sapping energy from the land or needing the land in terms of dependence. That belongs to the buyer. So if the creditor grabs the land at that point, the buyer is entitled to, since it's ready to be carried on the shoulders and harvested, the buyer is entitled to keep that. It doesn't belong to the creditor. As far as the produce that's nearly ripened, the creditor can collect it, but only if he compensates the buyer for their value. So that's the case. And if there are any other improvements where the creditor may collect without paying compensation to the buyer, it's the buyer that must go back to the seller for compensation. So if seeds you spend 20,000 Rand on seeds, but nothing has grown yet, and the creditor says, I want my land back, then who does the buyer have a claim with? With the debtor who sold him that land. The creditor is entitled to take the land because nothing's showing from it yet, but the buyer might have still lost money. If it's partial growth, then if it's almost grown but still dependent on the land, the creditor would have to pay off the buyer for the produce. If it's independent of the land, it belongs to the buyer entirely. Okay, guys, we're done. I hope that share was decent.
Yeah, excellent. I was actually going to ask you about the seeds, but you dealt with it, so thank you for that. Then the second thing, I just wanted to just make one comment. Sure. I think it was Rabbi Meir, but I'm not 100% sure, who basically said if an animal starts, so I'm just going back to the beginning of the show more, the stuff that we were covering about the improvements with an animal, right? When with the ewe and with the offspring and with the what's it called, the shearings and all of that. I